The courtroom was silent, charged with the kind of tension that makes every shuffle, every cough, echo like thunder. Judge Emmet Sullivan leaned forward from the bench, his eyes narrowing, his voice weighted with authority and skepticism. "Do you have any real proof, Congresswoman?" The question was sharp, its purpose unmistakable to corner Jasmine Crockett, to strip her argument bare before the watchers packed into the chamber. His words were a challenge, a dismissal, a measured attempt to remind her who held the gavel. But Crockett did not blink. Her hands rested calmly on the table, her shoulders squared, her gaze locked and steady. She did not rise in fury or stumble in hesitation. The very weight of Sullivan's question seemed to roll toward her like a wave, yet somehow she met it with stillness, refusing to move, refusing to let his authority shake her. In that quiet stare, in that calm resistance, her presence became a foil to the judge's dominance, a surge of dignity standing against the press of power. The cameras caught everything. The flicker of Sullivan's impatience, the sharp tilt of his head, the impatience in his clipped demand. Behind him, the solemn grandeur of the courtroom seemed to underline the imbalance. A judge draped in centuries of institutional authority and a congresswoman armed with nothing but her preparation and her resolve. To most, it seemed impossible to win such a duel. But Crockett sat as if she had carried heavier storms and knew that silence, when wielded well, could be louder than shouting. One judge's challenge was about to change everything. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of these political moments. Trust me, what you are about to see will blow your mind. You could feel it ripple through the room. The clash wasn't just about one piece of evidence. It was about credibility, dignity, and the right to belong in the halls of power. The judge's question carried arrogance. Crockett's poise carried patience honed by every battle she had fought before. The moment hung, breaths tightened, and across the chamber, you could sense it. History was about to turn. But what she revealed next left even the judge utterly frozen.
Odd.
The exchange between Judge Emmet Sullivan and Jasmine Crockett did not unfold. In a vacuum, it reverberated in a nation already rattled by distrust, division, and doubt. The courtroom was more than just four walls of polished wood and the echo of gavels. It had become a stage for America's anxieties. The country was watching, restless, because what happened in that moment felt bigger than procedure. It was a confrontation between voices of the old establishment and the rising demand for dignity, justice, and truth. For decades, Judge Sullivan had embodied authority itself. His robe, the bench, the weight of his words carried the aura of permanence. In that seat, he symbolized skepticism hardened into power, the voice of tradition that often placed procedure over people. Too many, he represented institutions that seemed distant and unyielding, institutions that looked down skeptically at new voices, questioning whether they were qualified or real. His question, "Do you have any real proof?" was not simply judicial inquiry. It carried establishment arrogance, the presumption that Crockett, a newer figure in political life, could not possibly meet the standard. It was a question loaded with history, with echoes of every dismissal that had ever kept marginalized people from being believed. And then there was Jasmine Crockett. She was not seasoned by decades in gilded chambers, nor did she carry the air of aloof detachment. She walked in with the resonance of someone forged in trial by fire, a civil rights attorney who had defended those cast aside, a woman who had organized in neighborhoods where institutions had long failed to listen. She was the embodiment of a different kind of authority, one born of empathy, of lived struggle, of resilience sharpened into steel. Her presence, steady and unflinching, shifted the courtroom into something new. Crockett's calm wasn't just composure. It was defiance wrapped in dignity, a signal that truth no longer needed permission to exist. That was why the stakes towered so high. The judge's sharp demand may have seemed like one question about evidence, but in reality the battle was so much larger. It was about whether America could trust the voices of those who had not been born into its circles of power. It was about whether truth, presented calmly and clearly, could outweigh centuries of skepticism thrown at outsiders. The exchange wasn't about a file, a document, or a specific fact. It was about belief, belonging, and credibility in the eyes of a watching nation. The onlookers knew it. Those seated quietly in the back shifted in their chairs, their eyes darting from the stern glare of Judge Sullivan to the steady gaze of Jasmine Crockett. Across the country, television audiences felt the weight too. Families whispered to one another, anxious, sensing that this wasn't simply political theater. This was a crucible for trust itself. Who gets to define what is real? Who gets to decide whose words are credible enough to shape America's future? Judge Sullivan pressed with the full weight of the system at his back, every syllable dipping with establishment doubt. But Crockett's silence, her refusal to fluster or break, was just as powerful. She had already shifted the center of gravity. The imbalance between courtroom authority and outsider resilience wasn't as unshakable as it once seemed. The question now was, would her answer merely defend herself, or would it shatter the assumption that this imbalance was permanent? The energy in the room made one thing clear. The challenge was larger than the bench. It was larger than two individuals. This was the timeless struggle between exclusion and belonging, arrogance and dignity. America leaned forward, the suspense brimming not just in what she would say, but in what her proof would mean. And this wasn't the first time Sullivan tried to corner Crockett, but it would be the last time he underestimated her. For years, Judge Emmet Sullivan's reputation had loomed like a storm over anyone who walked into his courtroom. He was known for his forceful presence, a robe not just worn but wielded like armor, and a persona less like a neutral arbiter and more like a commander in battle. Two lawyers, politicians, and witnesses alike, standing before him often felt less like an opportunity to present arguments and more like enduring a test set up with darker intentions. His toughness was legendary, his unpredictability unnerving, and his authority rarely questioned. There were countless stories whispered through the halls about Sullivan's intensity, how he could dismantle a defense with one question, how he relished forcing attorneys into uncomfortable silences where their words evaporated under his stare. The gavel in his hand was not just a tool of order, it was an extension of his authority. A single bang could cut through heated debate and freeze lawyers in mid-sentence, startling the unprepared and even rattling the seasoned. Many times observers left his courtroom describing the sensation of being under siege, as though the judge himself had become part prosecutor, part executioner, relishing the discomfort. His style of questioning was confrontational by design, had a way of leaning over the bench, his brows tightened, and asking questions not to seek clarity, but to strip away confidence. Do you have the proof? Where is the source? Is this real evidence? The words themselves weren't remarkable, but the way they were delivered, sharp, dismissive, dripping with skepticism, always carried the message beneath the surface. I am here to put you in your place. It was theater, but theater with consequences, as attorneys stumbled, faltered, and often caved under the pressure. Those who had endured his interrogations described his stare as almost unbearable. Witnesses said his eyes could lock onto yours, in a way that felt like exposure, as though every insecurity, every hidden doubt, was being pulled to the surface for judgment. And too often, those locked in his gaze crumbled, their voices quivering, their arguments weakening, their resolve dissipating under the glare of his authority. Sullivan's courtroom dominance was not accidental. It grew out of a belief he carried deep within himself that the position of judge elevated him above those before him. That superiority did not need to be earned anew each day, only exercised. He didn't just manage proceedings, he ruled them. Lawyers didn't enter as equals to engage in a battle of ideas. They entered as competitors, hoping to survive an uneven match against a judge who set the rules and moved the goalposts at will. The arrogance slipped out in little gestures, a subtle smirk when someone failed to meet his standards, as though he'd known their weakness all along. The dismissive wave of the hand, tossing aside arguments unsatisfying to him. The clipped tone when repeating a question he'd already asked. It's not to gather better answers, but to tighten the rope until the one before him gasped for air. He thrived in that discomfort. It wasn't simply adjudication, it was domination dressed in robes. Observers often debated whether this approach made him effective or destructive. Supporters claimed his unpredictability kept corruption in check. Critics argued his theatrics eroded trust, making proceedings less about truth and more about spectacle. What was undeniable was the consistency of his performance. He enjoyed the sport of power, the thrill of cornering others until the outcome was obvious. And in that sport, the judge rarely lost. The cinematic image of Sullivan in his element was unforgettable. The sharp crack of the gavel reverberating like a gunshot through the chamber, his voice dropping low, measured, chilling, as he dismantled a lawyer with surgical impatience. Cold smirk lingering, as though daring the next person to step forward and meet his gaze. The room often bent itself around him. Those who resisted did not leave triumphant. They left chastened, reminded that in Sullivan's courtroom, there was one ruler on the bench, and everyone else was subordinate. It was in this tradition of courtroom spectacle that he carried himself the day he turned his fire toward Jasmine Crockett. She was not the first woman, nor the first lawyer, nor the first politician to stand in his line of fire. He had cornered many before for sport and watched them fold beneath the weight of his authority, smirking at their hesitation. Like a cat watching its prey hesitate under paw, he had no reason to expect this moment would be any different. After all, he had honed his craft for years, leaning on his authority as both shield and sword. His belief remained unquestioned in his own mind, that arrogance was indistinguishable from power, and power was self-justifying. Anyone who crossed him could be broken down with one question, one stare, one loud rap of the gavel. For Sullivan, it was always the same. The robe guaranteed control. The bench assured victory. And so, when he turned his skepticism toward Jasmine Crockett, asking for real proof with that signature mix of derision and dismissal, his trademark, Sneer suggested he expected another easy win. Long before she was sitting under the sharp glare of Judge Emmet Sullivan, Jasmine Crockett carried with her a story that didn't start in marble courtrooms or political stages. It began in the humbler corners of America, where children were told to fight for every inch of respect they could earn. Born into the real struggles of ordinary people, she knew what it meant to sit in classrooms where her brilliance was questioned, to hear adults whisper doubts about what a girl like her could become. From her earliest days, perseverance became less of a choice and more of a survival instinct. In those classrooms, Crockett fought battles that never made the evening news, but shaped the core of who she would become. When others tried to silence her questions or dismiss her ambitions, she kept raising her hand, kept demanding space. Prejudice and doubt followed, but each time it landed, she carried the bruise like armor. Instead of bowing under weight, she stood taller. That resilience, forged in the seemingly insignificant struggles of youth, became the foundation of her fearless public voice. Her legal training gave that voice sharper edges. Crockett didn't ease her way into comfortable roles. She chose the grittiest work, the fights that mattered the most to people no one was listening to. Night after night, she scoured files until her eyes blurred, poring over pages that others ignored because the cases were too tough or the clients were too poor. She defended those without power, the wrongfully accused, the marginalized, the dispossessed whom the system had already written off. While many lawyers used the law to climb toward personal prestige, Crockett wielded it as a shield and a weapon for those who had none. Her late nights were filled not with celebration, but with preparation. Illuminated by desk lamps and surrounded by towers of paper that whispered of injustice, she refused to let stand. In courtrooms where nearly every gaze doubted her, Crockett stood alone, unflinching. Judges leaned back with dismissive smirks. Prosecutors tried to out-talk her, but she refused to bend under arrogance. The files she clutched weren't just legal documents. They were lifelines for people who had been told their lives didn't matter. Each time she argued, each time she held ground under the pressure of gavel and glare, she wasn't fighting for prestige. She was carving dignity into systems designed to deny it. She became more than just a lawyer. She became a force of empathy. Sharpened into action, across neighborhoods hollowed by neglect, she organized with people desperate for clean streets, for schools with working heaters, for leaders who bothered to care. City by city, block by block, she listened to their grievances. Parents who scraped together 2 jobs to keep the lights on. Immigrants asked where their citizenship papers were, as if belonging required them to prove it anew each day.
Young people
Who had already resigned themselves to ceilings too low for their dreams. Crockett didn't just record their stories, she carried them forward into rooms where their voices had no seat. Cinematic images of those years tell a story larger than words. Crockett at a community meeting standing between frustrated neighbors and city officials, her voice calm but unrelenting. Crockett sitting cross-legged on a hardwood floor, surrounded by children in a church basement, explaining that their voices mattered. Crockett in a near-empty office at midnight, stacks of briefs spread before her, jaw set as exhaustion melted into determination. In those moments, she wasn't simply practicing law or doing politics, she was shaping herself into a vessel. For others, every hardship that sought to diminish her instead sculpted her. The insults that once questioned her qualifications became fuel. The dismissals by those who told her she didn't belong became proof of why she did. When she stepped onto political stages, she didn't speak with the polish of elites rehearsed by handlers. She spoke with the unshakable cadence of someone who had lived the battles herself. She remembered every classroom where her hand stayed raised until acknowledged. Every courthouse where silence was a weapon wielded against her. Every late night where fatigue threatened but duty persevered. That history is what gave her presence. Such force beneath Judge Sullivan's gaze. She had already endured harder storms, harder dismissals, harder challenges than a single man cloaked in judicial authority could bring. What he thought of as intimidation was, to her, familiarity. She recognized the attempt to dismiss, to corner, to belittle because it was the same tactic her clients had endured when systems pressed them down. The same tactic she had fought since childhood. For Crockett, the weight of that moment in Sullivan's courtroom wasn't hers alone to carry. She represented everyone who had been told their proof wasn't good enough. Their words weren't credible enough, or their presence wasn't acceptable enough. When she sat steady under his stare, she was not just Jasmine Crockett, the Congresswoman. She was the embodiment of every underestimated worker. Every immigrant parent, every student dismissed before finishing a sentence. Every trial she had lived. Every fight she had waged. Every night she had worked through fatigue had delivered. Heard at this exact inflection point, Sullivan thought the courtroom was his stage, but Crockett knew better. She had spent her life preparing for moments when doubt would attempt to invalidate truth. Her calm wasn't accidental. It was earned by years of perseverance, and now, every trial she had endured was about to converge into one defining showdown. The gavel struck once, echoing like a reminder of who held power. Judge Sullivan's voice cut sharply through the chamber, the weight of his impatience breaking the air. "Congresswoman, I'll ask Agundu, you have any hard proof?" His tone wasn't genuine inquiry. It was the dare of a man convinced he could corner anyone with the sheer pressure of his authority. Crockett inhaled slowly, her posture unbothered as she prepared to speak. But before her words could find daylight, Sullivan leaned forward again, cutting across her with the irritation of someone threatened by time slipping from his control. "Spare us the rhetoric," he demanded, waving one hand as though brushing away her presence. "Answer the question, directly. Proof yes or no." Exchange tightened the air in the room. Every person present felt the imbalance. A judge cloaked in centuries of authority, trying to break a congresswoman who represented something he didn't fully understand, someone who did not exist to bend under tradition. The audience squirmed, their eyes bouncing between Sullivan's domineering tone and Crockett's unwavering composure. Some looked away, unable to bear the visible clash. Others leaned in as if they already sensed history sharpening itself in the tension. Crockett opened her mouth again, and again Sullivan broke in. The interruptions rained down relentlessly, faster than her chance to gather momentum. "Do you even have fact, Congresswoman? Not passion? Not speculation? Proof?" His words chopped through like axes, his voice raised, the measured patience of a judge gone, replaced with naked displays of dominance. But what he mistook as dominance exposed something else: desperation. Crockett remained still, Her face held composure the way steel holds its form against fire. The longer he spoke over her, the more obvious his cracks became. His voice sharpened to cover the fact that he was losing control of the narrative. His hand tapped impatiently against the bench, not like a ruler but like a man rattled with unease, the observers noticed. The murmurs whispered through the crowd. Told the truth, arrogance cannot disguise insecurity forever. Still, Crockett bided her time. Every pause between interruptions became a calculation. Every stolen second of silence between Sullivan's jabs became her preparation. She did not look flustered, nor eager to fire back. Instead, she let him lose himself in his pace, let him carve out the image of arrogance unraveling. To meet his storm with her own would only turn the chamber into noise. To wait was to choose her moment as deliberately as a surgeon chooses the exact incision point. And the audience could feel it that something sharper than Sullivan's interruptions was coming. They leaned forward in their seats. Some clutched their notepads tighter, sensing the collision on the horizon. The tension in the air jammed the chamber tighter than any closing of doors. Every glare, every shuffle, every glance turned to Crockett, still measured, still precise. Her stillness was not surrender. It was orchestration. Every ounce of silence was her hand tightening the bowstring. She had let Sullivan expend his voice. Let him paint the scene of arrogance so vividly that the room was primed to despise it. The chamber had transformed from a place where only he could roar into a place waiting for what she would reveal. The question wasn't whether she could answer it, was what she would choose to reveal. And when. And though Sullivan pressed harder, his voice practically snapping under the force of his interruptions, Crockett never broke. Not once. Instead, she leaned into the microphone, eyes sharp and glass-still, drawing in one final breath. Around her, the room seemed to inhale with her, every body poised, every heart hammering. It was no longer a question of evidence, no longer a test of endurance. The clash had boiled to its breaking point, the courtroom trembling in its anticipation. The interruptions had become hollow, the authority fragile, and all the noise hung waiting to be overtaken by something greater. And in that instant, every gaze fell squarely on Jasmine Crockett, knowing what came next would decide not just the battle in that chamber, but the story that would echo beyond its walls. The storm of interruptions had reached its peak. Judge Sullivan, his voice rising with each word, had barked demands with the kind of force he believed could bend anyone into submission. But Jasmine Crockett had not bent. She had waited, measured, watched the arrogance swell and sputter, knowing that timing could be more powerful than volume. And as silence finally opened before her, the room seemed to pivot in expectation, every eye narrowing to catch her first words. Her voice broke that silence, not with bluster, but with precision. Calm and sharp, each syllable perfectly placed. "Judge, you've asked for proof," she said, her tone cutting through the chamber like a scalpel. "Let me give you exactly that." The crowd stilled. Laptops closed mid-keystroke. Pens froze above paper. She reached for the folder before her, not hurried, not flustered, but deliberate. Her hand as steady as if she had rehearsed this very moment for years. She opened it, lifted her gaze toward Sullivan, and began. "Here's the timeline. You." Claimed was speculative. Her fingers tapped the page gently, her tone steady, her cadence measured like a rhythm crafted for maximum weight. On this date, at this hour, the original filing was entered into the record, corroborated not only by sworn testimony but authenticated by electronic log. That evidence has been cross-examined and verified. Every line came like a hammer, not struck wildly, but driven with calculated force. Points layered seamlessly. Document, authentication, corroboration, testimony. No yelling, no theatrics, just an overwhelming cascade of facts that built like an avalanche, slow at first, then impossible to stop. She paused, not to collect herself, but to let the silence deepen. The courtroom only minutes before pulsing, with interruptions now throbbed with anticipation. Sullivan opened his lips as though to cut across her once more, but no words came. Instead, his mouth closed slowly, the confidence of his smirk faltering as if his own authority had frozen. Mid-breath, Crockett continued, her voice precise, deliberate. "And as to your question of credibility," she pressed, "you will find that not only were these sources verified, but they were verified by individuals appointed under your own supervision." The weight of that sentence hung as heavy as stone. Gasps broke faintly from the benches, low murmurs spreading like the first roll of distant thunder. She did not raise her volume. She didn't need to. Every pause was a spotlight. Every unshaken tone was contrast to the fiery interruptions that had dominated the minutes before. Where Sullivan's arrogance had crowded the space, Crockett's poise emptied it, stilling everything into her cadence, her pacing, her truth. Now her gaze lifted from the papers. She let her words rest bare without aid, leaning slightly closer to the microphone. "So when you ask me whether I have proof," she concluded, "the question is not whether proof exists. The question is whether you are ready to acknowledge it." The sentence struck like a gavel of its own. The room, already tense, cracked open into gasps, audible even beneath the heavy ceilings. Observers leaned forward, some mouths parted in disbelief, others whispering quickly to neighbors who shook their heads in awe. The power dynamic that once belonged squarely to Sullivan no longer lived at the bench. It radiated from the seat where Crockett sat composed. Sullivan's face betrayed the shift. The once firm smirk vanished fully, replaced with the tightness of a jaw under stress. A vein pulsed faintly at his temple as he leaned back into his chair. His eyes darted toward his notes, then away, then back again, as though the very script he had tried to hold had been ripped from his grip. The silence he had once thrown like a weapon now rebounded upon him, heavier and sharper than any gavel could deliver. The image burned itself into memory. The judge, frozen mid-expression, authority stripped down to raw disbelief. And beside him, the Congresswoman, steady, breathing evenly, poised as if she had known this ending before the game ever began. The murmurs in the chamber turned into something larger, something undeniable. Whispers carried phrases like she just buried him, and that's it. That's the end. The ripple coursed outward, beyond those wooden walls, out to the world waiting beyond. Smartphones captured frames of Sullivan's stunned face, of Crockett's deliberate delivery, and within minutes those clips would take wing on social media. Twitter would seize them first, hashtags bursting into life, hashtag frozen judge, hashtag Crockett proof, hashtag shut down with facts. But in the moment itself, none of that had yet happened. All anyone inside the room could think was how quickly arrogance had unraveled, how thoroughly dominance had dissolved. This was not mere rebuttal, it was reframing. Crockett had not simply survived the test. She had reversed it, making clear that the question was never whether she had proof, but whether power was willing to hear it. Each line of evidence, each pause, each steady glance had rebuilt the balance in the room. Her composure revealed his performance for what it was. Not control, but fragility disguised as power. She had pulled the gavel from his hands without ever touching it, exposing arrogance with nothing more than grace under pressure. Sullivan's stillness became as memorable as her words. Cameras zoomed in, lenses trained on the face of a man who appeared for once less like authority and more like audience. Caught in stunned silence as dignity dismantled arrogance. In another corner of the chamber, a spectator leaned over to another, whispering what many would echo online within hours. That's the moment everything flipped. And they were right. For all the years of reputation Sullivan had cultivated as an unflinching, domineering force, all it took was one woman armed with preparedness, truth, and calm to dismantle it. Like glass under pressure, his veneer cracked in real time. Gavel no longer commanded the stage. The facts did, and they belonged to her. It wasn't just a comeback. It was a dismantling. It's pure and undeniable. But the freeze on Sullivan's face was only the beginning. The real aftershock was still to come. The chamber had barely released its breath before the outside world swallowed the moment whole. Within minutes, what had happened between Judge Emmet Sullivan and Jasmine Crockett was no longer confined to the walls of the courtroom. It had erupted into the bloodstream of the internet. Smartphones lit up like a city at night, timelines flooding with the clip that showed Sullivan's face frozen, his smirk dissolved, authority rattled beyond repair. Hashtags burst into life with the speed of wildfire. Hashtag frozen judge, hashtag Crockett proof, hashtag shut down by facts. On TikTok, the moment adopted a life of its own. Creators cut Sullivan's stunned expression into slow-motion montages, layering the silence that followed with booming bass drops, dramatic violin strings, even comic sound effects that turned his embarrassment into viral spectacle. One edit juxtaposed his frozen expression with images of shattering glass, the caption flashing, "Arrogance meets its match." Another clip looped the exact second his smirk vanished, text hovering above in bold red, "Busted." Millions gathered in the comments, laughing, celebrating, and marveling at how one line of proof delivered with precision could topple arrogance so completely. Twitter and Instagram caught fire. Screenshots of Sullivan's face became memes overnight. Some paired it with the caption, "When you realize you picked the wrong opponent." Others transformed Crockett into a superhero figure, stitching together images of her composure alongside hashtags like hashtag Grace Under Fire and hashtag Justice Delivered. Dignity had gone viral. For once, it wasn't mockery but validation that carried the day. But beyond the meme factory, serious voices weighed in just as heavily. Political commentators replayed the clip on evening broadcasts, breathlessly analyzing every frame. One anchor said, "You can point to thousands of political debates, but this is the moment arrogance finally met preparation." Academics joined in, writing essays and Twitter threads in real time about what Crockett's moment symbolized. Law professors dissected her rhetorical mastery, noting how her cadence turned every pause into power, every fact into spectacle. Communication experts praised her for reframing the exchange entirely. Sullivan wanted to make it about authority, but she made it about truth. National headlines stamped the verdict by morning. Major outlets ran banners like, "The showdown heard across the country," frozen in real time, and Crockett rewrites the power dynamic. For Sullivan, the narrative was devastating. Where he had once stood as the commanding figure, his reputation for toughness now looked more like frailty exposed. For Crockett, the opposite was true. She became not simply the victor of an argument, but the embodiment of standing, and firm in the face of arrogance. Even late-night comedians got in on the action, projecting the courtroom footage with commentary that mixed humor with awe. One joked, "That's not a stare-down, that's a career chill." The audience roared, not because the joke was cruel, but because it wasn't far from the truth. They'd all seen with their own eyes. Sullivan had been frozen by a single, unshakable display of proof. And yet, while laughter, memes, and mockery spread like wildfire, something deeper hummed beneath the noise. People at kitchen tables and in community halls spoke about what they'd witnessed not as just entertainment, but as validation. For communities long dismissed by authority figures, the moment meant more than Sullivan's stumble. It meant the possibility of being heard, of showing that the arrogance of power could finally be checked. Comments on social media carried this. "Resonance," she answered, "for every time we've been cut off mid-sentence. Every time we were told we didn't have proof, this was for us." Families passed the clip around with notes like, "This is history." Teachers played the exchange in classrooms as an example of truth wielded with precision. Faith leaders quoted Crockett's words in sermons, reminding congregations that dignity is more enduring than intimidation. Sullivan was diminished in ways he likely couldn't have imagined. His expression became a cautionary tale, replayed endlessly as an example of arrogance undone. Crockett, by contrast, moved beyond the exchange itself into symbolism, which was no longer simply Jasmine Crockett, the Congresswoman. She became a stand-in. For every voice dismissed, every immigrant questioned, every ordinary person cornered by those who thought their power placed them above accountability, her poise was transformed into collective pride. It wasn't just politics, it was culture. Crockett represented composure in a world addicted to outrage, precision in an arena built on noise, and authenticity in a system buried under performance. That's why the moment stretched beyond memes, and into the marrow of the people watching. But beyond all the hashtags and all the laughter, beyond the headlines and superb cuts on TikTok, the real story was not about Sullivan's fall or even Crockett's rise. It was about what dignity looks like when it stands face to face with arrogance and makes it crumble. The memes may fade, the hashtags may cycle out of trend, but the lesson carried forward would burn deeper and last longer. Because what she proved wasn't simply her case. She proved a truth larger than evidence or argument in the world was. About to feel just how powerful that truth could be. In the hours and days that followed, the courtroom clash between Judge Emmet Sullivan and Jasmine Crockett crystallized into something far larger than an isolated exchange. What began as a challenge, a demand for real proof barked with impatience and arrogance, was transformed by Crockett into a parable about dignity, truth, and the kind of strength that endures long after noise fades. She had done more than win an argument. She reframed the entire definition of power. Her proof had not only silenced the interruptions of a single judge, it had revealed a universal truth that the foundations of leadership don't reside in shouting, dismissing, or demanding obedience. Evidence matters. Preparation matters. Service matters. And when those qualities are wrapped in calm composure, they outweigh even the loudest attempts to dominate a room. Sullivan's barbed question, an attempt to erode her credibility, ended up exposing his own fragility. In contrast, Crockett's steady delivery turned every second into testimony that dignity beats bluster. For communities watching across America, and the resonance ran deeper than politics. Too many Crockett's composure felt intimately personal. Immigrants who had been told to go back saw in her the quiet rebuttal they had carried silently for years. Women accused of being too emotional in spaces of power saw themselves vindicated as Crockett wielded silence and poise as the sharpest of blades. Students denied opportunities. Workers told they weren't qualified. Entire groups marginalized by arrogance dressed as authority. Every one of them glimpsed in her not only a representative, but a reflection. This was why the moment spread. Far beyond the sphere of law and politics, because Crockett reminded the country that dignity doesn't just protect the individual who carries it. It speaks for everyone who has been forced to endure dismissals and doubts. Each pause she took was a lesson in restraint as power. Each fact laid carefully on the record was proof that truth, when backed by resilience, cannot be denied indefinitely. The more Sullivan demanded proof, the more Crockett's very presence became the evidence that people needed. In an age where arrogance often drowns out dialogue, where volume masquerades as vision, Crockett demonstrated the rarest and most necessary virtue, the discipline to let facts, not fury, define the moment. This was the emotional crescendo the audience carried away, the realization that you don't conquer arrogance by replicating its excesses. You conquer it by refusing to be reduced to its level. Calm strength isn't passivity. Calm strength is precision. It withstands interruption until the interruption crumbles under its own futility. Sullivan had tried to dominate through stature, smirk, and impatience. But what he discovered that day, and what the entire world witnessed, was that domination is fragile. It dissolves the second dignity, refuses to bow. Crockett's victory wasn't one line, one piece of proof, or one silence. It was the culmination of every trial she had faced before. Every doubt turned into fuel. Every dismissal turned into resolve. And in that courtroom, her lifelong resilience manifested into a mic drop that spoke for millions. The broader lesson was unmistakable. Leadership isn't about volume. It isn't about who can interrupt longest or sneer hardest. Leadership is vision built on service. It is humility built on perseverance. It is the ability to turn insult into inspiration. Crockett didn't just disprove Sullivan's skepticism. She showed a nation that real strength lies not in belittling others, but in lifting the truth high enough for it to be undeniable. And so the audiences who replayed that moment, who retweeted the clip, who told their families, "Watch this. This is history," weren't only celebrating a courtroom takedown. They were celebrating the idea that their own voices, undervalued for too long, could stand steady against arrogance and win. that the same calm, the same clarity, the same courage that Crockett carried could belong to them as well. The silence that followed her. Mic drop wasn't just Sullivan's silence. It was the hush of realization. Arrogance had been unmasked. Dignity had been elevated. And from that silence rose a message that will survive long after the clip finishes trending. Because in the end, Crockett proved the truth that endures above all else. Leadership is not about dominance, but service. Not about volume, but vision. What began as a pointed challenge from the bench, a judge demanding real proof, with the sharp edge of arrogance, ended as something no one in that courtroom or across the country would forget. Sullivan's reputation for dominance, for pressing and cornering others until they faltered, shattered beneath the weight of Crockett's calm delivery. His face, caught frozen in disbelief, became the image replayed millions of times. And Crockett's voice, steady and precise, became the proof that turned the tables. The emotional payoff echoed louder than the gavel.
Arrogance
Was not just confronted, it was exposed. What once looked like unquestioned authority dissolved before dignity that refused to bend. In that moment, Crockett didn't only defend herself. She defended every voice ever silenced, every worker ever dismissed, every immigrant told they didn't belong. She proved that dignity backed by truth can withstand even the harshest authority and win, and that is where you come in. This channel exists to hold on to those moments, to lift them above the noise so they don't fade into clips or hashtags. If you believe in truth over arrogance, in service over dominance, then be part of this movement. Hit the like button. It helps amplify these stories. Subscribe so you never miss the next showdown where dignity takes its stand. Share this video with someone who still needs the reminder that arrogance doesn't last, but truth always does. Because these aren't just courtroom moments. They are lessons in resilience, in justice, in what belongs at the heart of leadership. Because sometimes one line of proof can freeze even the most powerful in silence.